It began with the sound of something far away and yet close enough to press into the bones, a low rolling thunder that had no rhythm of storm or sea, a rumble that seemed to swallow the air in waves. And when your eyes opened, you were not in your room, not in your century, but on your back in a damp hollow smelling of churned earth and cordite. The light above weak and yellow as if the sun had been strained through dust and smoke, and for a moment you thought this must be a dream. One of those surreal nightmares where history tangles itself around you. But then came the clatter of boots on duckboards and the bark of a voice in an accent both foreign and strangely familiar. And as you turned your head, the world swam into shapes you recognized only from photographs. The jagged lip of a trench wall, sandbags stacked like uneven teeth, the dull gleam of a rifle-S bayonet catching the thin light. And you understood with a sudden stomach-turning clarity that you were in a place you had read about but never expected to inhabit. The Western Front, World War I, and the sky itself seemed weighted with the knowledge of how many would die beneath it. The man above you, lean unshaven face streaked with grime, was shouting something not to you but to someone down the line. And though his words were swallowed by the noise, you could pick out enough to know that an attack was coming. And it was this realization, more than the stench of mud and latrine, or the sight of rats darting between crates, that made your heart pound like a drum. You were not merely visiting history, you were caught inside it, and whatever rules had governed your safe life before had been stripped away in a single, incomprehensible shift. Your clothes were not your own. Heavy wool, damp and worn thin at the elbows, the rough weight of a petty wound around your calf, boots caked in the black soup of the trench floor, and in your hands, absurdly heavy and yet oddly familiar, was a Lee Enfield rifle, its wood dark with oil and age, the metal cool against your skin. The sling was digging into your shoulder, as though it had been there for hours, and as you struggled to stand, the world tilted, the boards beneath your boots slick and uneven, and a boy, barely 18, eyes wide and cheeks hollow, caught your arm muttering steady, "Mate, don't want to go over before we have to," and then giving a small, humorless smile that made you realize he thought you belonged here, that you were one of them, another soldier in this long, narrow slice of earth where time moved between bombardments and nothing else. The trench itself was a winding scar, its walls reinforced with a patchwork of timber and corrugated iron, the parapet bristling with the muzzles of rifles waiting for orders. The air was a compound of mud, sweat, tobacco, and decay, and every sound, the scrape of a spade, the drip of water, the distant boom of artillery, felt sharper, more intimate, as though the war were not something happening in fields and towns, but inside the very marrow of those who stood here. Somewhere to your left, a man was reading a letter by the light of a small hooded lamp, his lips moving silently as though speaking the words to himself, while another nearby picked at the lice in his tunic with a kind of weary patience that suggested the insects had won long ago. Further down, two soldiers argued quietly over the exact distance to the German lines, one swearing it was no more than 70 yards, the other insisting it was 100, and you realized that somewhere beyond this wall of earth and sandbags there were men, enemy men, waiting, listening, perhaps having the same conversation in a mirrored trench. The officer appeared suddenly a silhouette against the dim sky, his boots striking the duckboards with a crisp authority, his Sam Brown belt gleaming faintly despite the grime. He glanced at each man in turn, his eyes lingering on you for a moment as though weighing your readiness, then moved on, giving orders in a clipped voice. "Stand to at first light, ammunition ready, keep low, no bloody scatlining." And the men responded with murmured, "Yes, sir, s," their faces set in that expression peculiar to soldiers who have accepted they may not see another sunset. When the officer was gone, the boy who had steadied you earlier leaned close, whispering, "Name's Tommy. Don't matter if you forget, not much lasts here except the mud and the rats." And though his tone was light, there was something in his eyes, a depth of fatigue you had never seen before, that told you he had watched more than one friend vanish into the smoke. The night dragged on in fragments, the occasional flare arcing up to cast a ghostly white over the shattered landscape beyond the trench, revealing coils of barbed wire and the skeletal remains of trees. The sound of a distant engine, perhaps a lorry, bringing up rations or shells. a low rhythmic thump of artillery in the far distance, too regular to be anything but deliberate, and you found yourself clutching the rifle without thinking, your fingers cold even through the gloves, your breath misting in the chill air. At some point you realized the war had its own kind of clock, not marked by hours, but by the rotation of sentries, the arrival of rations, the brief moments when men dared to light cigarettes. You shared one with Tommy, the smoke harsh and strangely comforting, and he told you in that half-muttered way of men in the dark, about home, about a sister who sent him a knitted scarf last winter, about the pub where he had once played darts, about a dog named Bess who would be waiting by the gate when he came back, and you could hear the unspoken if in every sentence, as if he did not quite believe in his own return. It was in the thin grey before dawn that the order came, a runner appearing breathless, mud to his knees, delivering a folded slip to the sergeant, who read it once, twice, then gave a sharp nod, and in the moments that followed, the trench changed, became something tighter, more focused. Men checked rifles, adjusted bayonets, tightened straps, their movements quick but deliberate, the joking gone replaced by a silence heavy enough to make the distant guns seem louder. You were handed 2 extra clips of ammunition, the cold brass catching in your palm, and someone slapped your shoulder with a muttered, "Keep your head down," and then the sergeant's voice cut through, "Stand 2, over in 10, and the line of men straightened, boots planted on the duckboards, eyes fixed on the ladder that would take them up and over into the killing ground. The boy, Tommy, gave you a look that was both fear and defiance, then faced forward, his knuckles white on the rifle's stock, and you understood in a rush that you were about to step into a moment from which there was no turning back. That history was not just words on a page, but the weight of the rifle in your hands, the mud on your boots, the sound of your own heartbeat as the sky began to pale, and the whistle, that thin, sharp cry that meant go, was raised to the sergeant's lips. The whistle's shriek cut the morning like a blade, high and piercing in the damp air, and before you could decide whether your legs were ready, they were moving, climbing the wooden rungs of the trench ladder slick with mud and the faint sheen of frost, your breath ragged in your chest, your hands gripping the rifle as though it might somehow anchor you to the earth. And then your boots met the churned ground of no man's land, and you were moving forward with the line. The cold wind immediately harsher out here, biting at your face, carrying with it the smell of cordite and the sickly sweetness of decay that lingered in the shell craters dotting the scarred terrain ahead. And you had no time to dwell on that smell, because the first machine gun opened up from the German lines. Its rattling burst like a saw tearing through the air, and the man to your right, a broad-shouldered corporal with a faded patch on his sleeve, went down with a grunt, not even a scream, his rifle spinning away into the mud. The ground was uneven, a patchwork of shell holes half filled with water, tufts of dead grass clinging stubbornly to the soil between the craters, and everywhere the remnants of barbed wire, some still taut, some twisted and broken, reached up like skeletal fingers to catch at your legs, your uniform, the strap of your rifle, and each snag felt like a hand trying to drag you down, back into the muck, and you could hear the whistle of bullets passing close enough to tug at the edges of your awareness, each one a reminder that any step might be your last. The air was alive with noise, now the chatter of machine guns, the boom of artillery, shells that landed with gut-punch force sending columns of mud and smoke into the air, the sharp cries of men hit, calling for medics, for mothers, for someone to tell them they were still alive. Tommy was ahead of you, small and fast, weaving between craters, his bayonet fixed, his helmet tilted slightly back as if he needed every inch of vision, and he tried to keep him in sight, tried not to lose him in the shifting chaos of bodies moving forward, slowing, diving for cover, surging again. The sergeant's voice was lost now, replaced by the deeper, more primal sound of men shouting to each other in short bursts. Left, wire ahead, down, and each cry seemed both urgent and already too late. A shell landed close enough to lift you off your feet, the sound like the sky tearing itself apart, your ears ringing in the sudden silence that followed. A silence broken a second later by the rush of blood in your head and the distant continuation of gunfire. You realized you were on your side, half in a crater, the water seeping through your tunic, the rifle still miraculously in your hands, And when you pushed yourself up, the world swam for a moment, the horizon tilting, the smoke in the distance thick enough to blur the outline of the German trench line, though you could still see the flicker of muzzle flashes like lightning trapped in a storm cloud. Somewhere to your left, a man was tangled in wire, his legs caught, his helmet gone, and two others were crawling toward him under a curtain of bullets that spat dirt and sparks around them. You saw one of the rescuers lurch suddenly, his body folding in on itself, and you forced your gaze away, because to watch too long was to invite the knowledge that it could just as easily be you, that in this place chance was king and no amount of skill or courage guaranteed you another breath. The forward momentum carried you toward a stretch of wire that had been blasted apart by artillery, and you followed Tommy through the gap your boots, slipping on the churned soil, the trench ahead suddenly clearer through the smoke, the dark shapes of helmets and sandbags resolving into the enemy's front line. The gunfire here was deafening, every shot echoing off the earthworks, and yet in the midst of it you could hear the shouted orders in German, sharp and clipped, followed by the deeper report of their rifles as they fired from the parapet. There was no pause, no moment to gather yourself. You and Tommy and the others reached the edge of the trench and dropped down into it, the landing jarring your knees, the space narrow and crowded with the bodies of both the living and the dead, the air thicker still with the smell of powder and sweat and something far worse. The fight here was sudden and intimate, rifles too long for the close quarters giving way to bayonets and entrenching tools, to fists and boots and the blunt ends of weapons, the sounds of impact and struggle loud in your ears, and you found yourself face to face with a young German soldier whose expression was as shocked and afraid as your own. His mouth open as if to speak before his rifle, but swung toward you, an instinct, not thought, brought your own weapon up to block. The moment dissolved into motion, into shouts and grunts, into the rush of boots along the duckboards, the clatter of dropped equipment, and at some point you realized the trench was being taken, the resistance faltering, prisoners being shouted toward the rear with their hands raised, their eyes wide and darting, searching for someone to explain how they had lived while others around them had not. Tommy appeared at your side again, breathless but grinning. A wild light in his eyes that was not joy exactly, but something closer to survival. The knowledge that he had made it through this particular minute, this particular hour, and that in this place, that was enough. The order came to hold the position, to brace for counterattack. And so you found yourself in a trench that had been the enemy's minutes before, its walls scarred by bullets, its floor littered with the detritus of hurried life, a dropped canteen, a torn letter, a tin of biscuits half crushed under a boot print, and you wondered who had stood here yesterday, whether they had imagined the possibility of waking up somewhere else, some other time the way you had, and whether they too had thought, for just a second, that perhaps this was all a dream. The guns did not stop. The quiet, when it came, was not the gentle hush of a meadow at dusk, nor the peaceful lull of a city street after the lamps were lit, but rather the taut, unnatural stillness of a hunted forest, the kind of silence that pressed against your ears until you could hear your own heartbeat drumming like distant artillery. And in that stillness, you and the others in the captured trench crouched low behind the battered parapet, your hands clenching the rifle, not for comfort, but because the moment you relaxed your grip you feared it would be gone, taken by some unseen force that was even now gathering on the other side of the smoke to retake what you had seized in the last furious minutes. The German line was close enough now that you could smell it, the acrid sting of burned powder, the faint sourness of sweat, soaked into wool the metallic tang of blood, and every sense was sharpened, every nerve wound tight, so that even the slow drip of water from a crack in the trench wall seemed loud enough to draw fire. Tommy knelt beside you, his helmet dented from some earlier impact, his eyes scanning the lip of the trench as if he could will the next attack to announce itself, and you realized that here, in this narrow strip of mud and blood and broken boards, your survival depended less on bravery than on the ability to read the signs, the change in the pitch of enemy voices, the shift in the pattern of gunfire, the sudden, pregnant silence that sometimes came just before a charge. The sergeant moved along the line, his voice low but urgent, telling men to check their ammunition, to set bayonets, to keep their heads down until the order came, and you found yourself obeying without thought, the muscle memory of a soldier taking over, even though a part of you still felt like an intruder in someone else's war. The first shells fell short, their explosions kicking up fountains of mud in no man's land. A warning more than a strike, and then the real barrage began, the sound rolling over you in waves. The air so thick with shockwaves that it seemed to compress your chest, each impact sending clods of earth and shards of wood into the air. Men hunched deeper into the trench, pulling collars up against the grit and debris, their faces lit in brief flashes by the explosions, and you realized that time here had no meaning. Seconds stretched into eternities. Minutes vanished in a heartbeat, and all that mattered was holding on until the barrage lifted. When it did, the silence was even shorter than before, broken almost immediately by the sharp staccato of whistles from the German side, the kind of sound that carried over smoke and confusion and told every man within earshot that the counterattack was coming. You rose just enough to peer over the parapet and saw them through the haze, dark figures moving forward at a steady pace, their rifles ready, their bayonets catching the weak light. And for a moment you thought of how similar they looked to you and your mates. The same mud on their boots, the same weariness in their stride, the same thin line between life and death stretched taut before them. The order came to fire, and you did the recoil punching your shoulder, the smell of the rifle's discharge filling your nostrils, the noise around you becoming a single, unbroken roar as every man along the trench added his voice to the deadly chorus. Some of the Germans fell, some stumbled and kept coming, and the rest surged forward, closing the distance with terrifying speed, until the shooting gave way to the brutal intimacy of close-quarters fighting, bayonets crossing, rifle butts swinging, boots slipping on the boards and in the mud. Someone shouted for grenades, and a handful were tossed into the oncoming mass, their blasts scattering men and sending fragments of shrapnel whistling through the air. The cries of the wounded rising above the din. It was chaos, the kind that strips away any notion of heroism and leaves only the raw instinct to survive. And in the midst of it, you lost sight of Tommy, your world narrowing to the man in front of you, a German soldier whose face was half hidden by the shadow of his helmet. His eyes locked on yours as he lunged, and you met him with the point of your bayonet, the jolt of impact running up your arms and into your bones. The two of you locked for an instant that felt both endless and fleeting before he slid away, leaving you gasping in the smoke and the screams. The counterattack faltered, broke, and then was gone. The surviving Germans retreating across the scarred ground, some dragging the wounded, others stumbling alone, their shapes dissolving into the haze as quickly as they had appeared, and the trench was suddenly filled with the sound of heavy breathing, of men checking themselves for wounds they hadn't felt in the heat of battle, of whispered names called into the settling smoke with no answer in return. You leaned against the wall of the trench, your legs trembling, your hands numb, and wondered how many more times this would happen, how many more attacks could be withstood before the line bent or broke. Somewhere down the trench, a corporal began collecting rifles from the dead and wounded, his movements efficient and without ceremony, while the sergeant scribbled notes to send back with the runners, reports of ammunition levels and casualty counts and the condition of the line. You caught a glimpse of Tommy then, crouched a few yards away, a shallow cut across his cheek and a look in his eyes that told you he had seen something in those last minutes that would never leave him. And he gave you the faintest nod before turning back to watch the horizon, as if expecting the next wave to already be forming. Above, the sky was the color of ash, and the wind shifted, carrying with it the faint sound of church bells from some unseen village far behind the lines. A sound so ordinary, so impossibly distant from the reality of this place, that for a moment you almost believed you had imagined it. Night came not as a gentle curtain drawn across the sky, but as a creeping tide of darkness that pooled first in the shell craters and trenches before swallowing the broken ground entirely. And with it came a cold so sudden and penetrating that it seemed to rise from the earth itself, seeping into boots and sleeves and gnawing at the edges of resolve and in that fragile in-between. After the last distant artillery had faded, but before the moon had risen, the trench was a world of silhouettes and whispers, every movement deliberate, every sound measured against the risk of carrying across no man's land 2 ears that still listened for weakness. You huddled against the mud wall beside Tommy, your breath a thin cloud in the chill air, and the two of you shared the last of a hard biscuit you could barely taste, its crumbs sticking to dry lips, your teeth aching from the cold. Men further down the line murmured to each other in low tones, voices muffled by scarves or collars pulled high, and somewhere a small tin cup was passed along with a few swallows of tea so black it might have been boiled in soot. Yet it warmed the hands and sent a faint thread of comfort through the body like a reminder that warmth was still possible. The sergeant made his rounds, stepping carefully to avoid the worst of the waterlogged boards, his shadow stretching long against the faint glow of a covered lantern, and at each cluster of men he repeated the same instructions. Keep your rifles close, bayonets fixed, no unnecessary talking, eyes on the horizon. And when he came to you, he paused long enough to hand over a strip of cloth to wrap around the rifle-less metal. The simple act sparing you from the bite of frozen steel should you need it before dawn. Then he was gone, swallowed again by the dark, a figure moving like the trench itself, part of the mud and the timber and the weary rhythm of holding a line that was never truly still. Somewhere across the void between the lines, a flare went up, hissing and crackling as it rose before bursting into pale light, its glow revealing the tortured contours of the land, the skeletal remains of trees, the jagged lips of craters, the frozen sheen on standing water, and for those few seconds every man instinctively pressed closer to the wall, making himself small, waiting for the light to fade before allowing muscles to unknot. When it did, the darkness seemed deeper, more absolute, and you were aware of your heartbeat again, slow but heavy, a counterpoint to the occasional drip of water and the rustle of cloth as men shifted their weight. It was during one of these still moments that Tommy spoke, his voice so low it barely carried to you, telling a fragment of a memory. A Sunday morning in his village, before the war, the bells calling people to the small stone church, the smell of fresh bread from the bakery on the corner, his father standing in the doorway of their cottage with his sleeves rolled, ready to carve the roast for dinner, and you realized he was not speaking for conversation's sake but as an anchor, as a way of holding on to a reality that existed far from here, a reality that the war could not entirely erase, no matter how much it took from the men who fought it. You shared your own memory in return, speaking of a walk you had once taken in a green field under a summer sun, how the grass had brushed against your palms, and the air had been alive with bees and as you spoke you saw the faintest smile on Tommy's face, the kind that flickers only for a heartbeat before vanishing again, as if afraid to draw too much attention to itself in a place like this. Neither of you spoke after that for a long while, the silence between you no longer empty, but filled with the unspoken understanding that sometimes the smallest fragments of home could keep a man standing when everything else had been stripped away. As the hours stretched on, fatigue set in, heavy and insistent, yet sleep was a dangerous luxury, for though the night seemed quiet, the enemy was no more than a few dozen yards away, and a sudden rush in the dark could come without warning. So you dozed in snatches, your chin dropping to your chest before jerking awake, your fingers never leaving the rifle's grip, your ears straining for any change in the night's cadence, the muffled scrape of boots, the thud of a body against frozen mud, the low murmur of foreign voices carried on the wind. At some point after midnight, the distant rumble of artillery began again, not the rolling barrage of battle but the intermittent thump of single shells fired at random intervals, their impact somewhere beyond the reach of your position, a reminder that the war was not sleeping, even if the front in your small stretch of trench seemed momentarily still. A runner arrived from the rear, his face pale in the lamplight, as he delivered a folded slip of paper to the sergeant, who read it in silence before tucking it into his coat and moving on without a word, his expression unchanged as if bad news and good news had long ago become indistinguishable here. When the moon finally broke through the clouds, it revealed the trench in shades of silver and shadow, the helmets lined along the parapet glinting faintly, the frost on the sandbags sparkling as if mocking the filth beneath. You looked up at it for a moment, that cold, distant light, and wondered if somewhere else in the world there was a person standing under the same moon, thinking of you without knowing exactly where you were or what you were enduring, and the thought lodged itself in your chest like a tiny ember, Not enough to warm you, but enough to keep you from freezing entirely. And then, just before dawn, when the eastern sky began to pale and the stars retreated, the stillness shattered with a single rifle crack from the German side, followed by another and another, until the trench was awake again, every man alert, every rifle aimed into the thinning mist, and you knew that the day ahead would not be a quiet one. The first light of morning was not the gentle gold of a summer dawn, but a thin grey smear that clung to the horizon like smoke, and through it came the low, guttural shout of commands in a language that seemed to cut through the mist like a blade, followed by the grinding metallic churn of boots and mud and the rattling clink of equipment. And before your mind could fully shape the thought of their coming, the air was torn open by the deep bark of a machine gun somewhere down the line, its rhythm a stuttering heartbeat of violence that drew answering fire from the German side until the space between the trenches was a haze of muzzle flashes and sharp reports. The sergeant's voice cut through the chaos, sharp and urgent, ordering you and the others to your firing positions. And your body moved before your mind caught up, boots sinking into the slats of the firing step, rifle pressed against your shoulder, eyes straining through the thinning fog for shapes that were at first only shadows, but soon resolved into the dark forms of men moving low, rifles in hand, bayonets gleaming faintly in the weak light. You squeezed the trigger and the rifle kicked hard against your shoulder, the crack of the shot swallowed almost immediately by the cacophony of the line, and somewhere in that murk one of those advancing figures dropped, the rest surging forward undeterred. The next minutes became a blur of reloading, firing, ducking, the acrid sting of cordite in your nostrils, the cold mud seeping through your knees as you knelt to steady your aim, and the air itself seemed to thicken with the mingled shouts and screams and the strange high-pitched whine of bullets passing close enough to feel their heat. Tommy was beside you, working his bolt action with a mechanical precision born of long practice, his face set in a mask of grim focus, and when a flare went up behind the German line, throwing the whole scene into sharp relief, you saw their wave break against the jagged edge of no man's land, men diving into shell holes for cover as others crawled forward inch by inch. Somewhere to your left, a section of the trench erupted in shouts as a shell landed close, showering the position with dirt and shrapnel, and you felt the shockwave roll through the ground beneath your boots. The sergeant bellowed for stretcher bearers, but their answering call was lost in the renewed thunder of the enemy's own artillery, a short, brutal barrage that slammed into the forward edge of your trench and rattled your teeth in your skull each impact, accompanied by a geyser of mud and smoke that made the air almost too thick to breathe. Then came the whistle, high and shrill, not from your line but theirs, and through the gaps in the haze you saw them rise from cover. A second wave, moving with the desperate determination of men who had already seen too much to turn back, and this time they closed the distance faster, some reaching the lip of your trench before they fell, others leaping down into the narrow space with rifles and bayonets flashing in the dim light. You dropped your rifle to draw your bayonet, and in that instant the world contracted to the man in front of you. His face a grim mask streaked with mud, his eyes wide with the same mix of fear and resolve you felt in your own chest. The clash was brutal, close, and clumsy, more shoving and grappling than the clean thrusts imagined in training, and the sound of it, grunts, the scrape of metal on metal, the dull wet thud when someone fell, was drowned only by the pounding of your own blood in your ears. You stumbled, recovered, pushed forward, and in that moment Tommy's rifle butt swung past you, catching another attacker in the jaw and sending him sprawling into the muck. Somewhere behind you, the Lewis gun opened up, its rattling fire stitching a path along the trench's edge and forcing the surviving attackers to drop or retreat. And within minutes, though it felt like hours, the space around you was still again. The only movement, the slow settling of dust and the twitch of a man's hand in the mud before it stilled entirely. The sergeant moved through the survivors, counting heads, his expression unreadable, while the stretcher bearers finally emerged, stepping carefully over the debris to tend to those who could still be saved. You leaned against the trench wall, chest heaving, fingers trembling not from the cold but from the sudden release of the fight's terrible grip. And when you looked at Tommy, he met your gaze for a moment, both of you wordless in the knowledge that you had survived something that could just as easily have ended differently. Over the lip of the trench, the morning fog was beginning to burn away, revealing the wreckage of the failed assault, and with it came the uneasy certainty that it would not be the last. Night did not fall in the way it once had in your memory of home, as a gentle deepening of shadow and a cooling of the air, but instead it came abruptly, swallowing the battlefield in a thick and almost tactile blackness that seemed to drink the light from the few surviving lanterns and left only the pale, intermittent flares as brief and violent intrusions, their glare throwing the skeletal remains of blasted trees and twisted wire into grotesque silhouette before vanishing again into the dark. And it was in this suffocating absence of sight that the sergeant's hand clapped your shoulder, his voice low and rough as he told you that you and Tommy were to be part of the night patrol tasked with slipping into no man's land to check the condition of the forward wire and to bring back any wounded stranded there since the morning S-fight. There was no chance to argue, no moment to dwell, only the quiet ritual of preparation, pulling on what extra gear you could manage without noise, checking the bolt of your rifle to ensure it would work silently, tightening the straps of your helmet so it wouldn't shift at the wrong moment, and then crouching low as you followed the small group of 5 men to a narrow section of trench that ended in a crude step up to the parapet. The moon was hidden behind a solid sheet of cloud and beyond the lip of the trench. The blackness was so complete that the ground ahead felt more imagined than real a place. You stepped into not with your feet, but with the unsteady conviction that it had to be there or else you were falling into nothing. The first few yards were a slow, careful crawl, the ground sucking at your hands and knees, every movement measured against the creak of leather or the clink of metal, the sounds magnified in your ears by the silence between distant gunfire. You could feel Tommy's presence behind you, his breath controlled, and the slight pressure on your boot when he needed you to pause so the man ahead could check the ground for tripwires or loose debris that might betray your position. Somewhere far off, an artillery gun sent a single shell whistling overhead, the sound growing, then fading into the distance before ending in a muted thump, and the group froze for a moment, listening for the telltale shuffle or low voice that might signal German sentries reacting. But none came, and so you pressed forward again, the stench of the churned earth mixing with something sharper, metallic, that you didn't want to name because you knew it came from the dark shapes you sometimes glimpsed lying half-buried or tangled in the wire. Reaching the first stretch of damaged wire, the corporal signaled for 2 men to begin quietly twisting the broken strands into makeshift knots, their hands wrapped in cloth to muffle the scrape of metal, while you and Tommy moved a little farther ahead to scan the ground for movement. Your eyes strained against the dark, every shadow a possible figure, every lump of earth, something that might shift when you looked away, and when one finally did, a low groan barely audible, you felt your gut tighten in that cold, unmistakable way that said it was a man, still alive, lying only a few yards ahead in a shallow depression. Crawling toward him felt like moving through the memory of a nightmare, each inch taking longer than it should. The sound of your own heartbeat loud enough to make you certain it was giving you away. And when you finally reached him, the pale flicker of a flare far behind you revealed a face caked in mud and blood, his eyes glassy but aware, his mouth forming words you couldn't hear. He wore the German field grey, though his helmet was gone, and for a moment you hesitated. The orders had been to bring back wounded if possible, but they had not said which sides. Before Tommy was beside you, his whisper urgent that you couldn't leave him there to bleed out under the wire. Between the 2 of you, you eased him onto a ground sheet, his breathing ragged and shallow, and began the long, agonizing drag back toward your own lines, pausing often to listen, to let the darkness swallow you again whenever you thought you heard a sound ahead. Twice, rifle bolts clicked somewhere in the black, and both times you froze, muscles screaming with the effort of holding still, until the noises faded and you moved again, slower now. The weight of the man between you growing heavier with every yard. The parapet loomed ahead at last, a darker shape against the dark, and the muffled hiss of a whispered password from the sentry made you exhale in a rush you didn't know you'd been holding. Strong arms reached down to haul the wounded man into the trench, and the sergeant's face appeared in the dim glow of a hooded lantern, his eyes narrowing for only a moment at the sight of a German uniform before he barked for the medics to get him patched and questioned later. When you and Tommy finally slumped onto a bench in the dugout, your hands were still trembling. Not from the cold, but from the lingering sense that something had been watching you out there, just beyond the reach of the flares, and that it had chosen for reasons you couldn't know to let you come back this time. The German soldier did not die that night, but when you saw him again in the dim recess of the aid station, lit by the steady yellow of oil lamps and heavy with the scent of iodine and damp earth, it was clear that death had not yet abandoned its pursuit. His face was pale in a way you had never seen in the living, lips tinged the faint gray of storm clouds, his eyes half-lidded but still, somehow, tracking the movements of those around him, and the medic, a thin man named Arthur whose hands never stopped moving even as he spoke in clipped half-set, told you that the shrapnel in his side had missed anything vital by sheer chance, though fever and infection were already circling like vultures. There was no small amount of muttering among the men about why you had dragged back one of them, and you could feel the unspoken question hanging in the air whenever you passed a knot of soldiers in the trench, whether you were soft in the head, or had some misguided notion about honor that would get someone killed. But the sergeant's word was law here, and he had made it plain that the prisoner would be kept alive if possible, for intelligence and for the principle of doing things by the book. Still you noticed that no one volunteered to watch him, except Tommy, who seemed to have taken on the role without comment, sitting on an overturned crate near the aid station door with his rifle across his knees, humming quietly under his breath. The morning came with a low, rolling fog that blurred the jagged skyline of the battlefield into a strange, almost gentle smear of grays, though the stillness of it was broken now and again by the distant crack of a sniper's rifle or the dull concussion of shells falling somewhere unseen. You were sent with a work detail to shore up part of the trench wall that had sagged in the rain, the mud slick and treacherous under your boots, and as you hauled sandbags into place, you caught yourself glancing toward the aid station more often than you should have, wondering why you cared whether the man inside, a man who under other circumstances might have killed you without hesitation, survived. It was late in the afternoon, the fog beginning to thin, when the German first spoke to you. You had been carrying a fresh water can in to refill the small pitcher by his cot, and as you turned to leave, his voice came low and hoarse in heavily accented English, asking your name. The sound of it stopped you mid-step, and when you told him, he nodded once, as if committing it to memory, then closed his eyes again without another word. The exchange should have meant nothing, yet you carried it with you for the rest of the day, replaying the way he had looked at you. Not with gratitude, exactly, but with a kind of weary recognition, as though he understood something about you that no one else in this place did. That night, during the brief pause between shelling runs, you found yourself drawn back to the aid station, where Tommy was dozing lightly in his chair, the prisoner awake and watching the small flame of a lamp dance against the canvas walls. He asked you, in halting words, where you were from, and when you told him, his mouth curved in the faintest suggestion of a smile. He said he had once known a man from there, long ago, before the war, and though the details were sparse, a name, a street, a summer spent working on ships, you realized with a small jolt that his memory placed him on your soil at a time when neither of you could have imagined ending up on opposite sides of the wire. For the first time you saw him not as the German, but as someone who had once been simply a man with work and laughter and plans. And that thought unsettled you more than the sight of blood ever had. It lingered as you returned to your own dugout, and it lingered even more strongly the next morning when orders came down that the brass would be inspecting the prisoner, and that he might be transferred to another unit's custody, a place where, you suspected, the thin protections of procedure might not be so carefully observed. By midday, the sergeant had you helping prepare the man for transport, wrapping him in blankets, checking the bindings on his stretcher, and though you told yourself it didn't matter what happened once he left your trench, you could feel the tightness in your chest. As you thought of him vanishing into some nameless rear camp swallowed by the machinery of the war, and then as you adjusted the knot on one of the ropes, he leaned ever so slightly toward you, his breath a faint whisper against your ear, and said something in German that you did not understand, but which carried in its tone a strange urgency, as though it were meant as a warning or a plea. You had no time to ask for a translation. The stretcher-bearers were already lifting him away, their boots squelching in the mud as they carried him toward the communications trench. But the sound of those few quiet syllables stayed with you long after he was gone, echoing against the walls of your thoughts, until you began to wonder whether you had just lost more than you realized. The rain came back that night, heavier than before, soaking into the trench walls until the earth seemed ready to collapse in on itself. The duckboard slick underfoot and the smell of wet wool, cordite, and rotting sandbags hanging thick in the air. And though you should have been sleeping in the cramped dugout you shared with 3 other men, your mind kept circling back to those words, foreign, sharp-edged syllables spoken by the German in that low, urgent tone, as if he had been trying to pass a message before it was too late. And the more you turned them over in your head, the more it gnawed at you that you did not know what they meant. By morning, the weather had worsened enough that visibility on the front was poor, but the guns never fully slept, and the constant rolling thunder of artillery was like a heartbeat you could never escape. Orders came down to help shift ammunition from a flooded storage dugout, and as you worked beside Tommy in the cold brackish water you finally asked him, because he had grown up with a German-speaking grandmother in Manchester, whether he could make sense of the phrase you repeated from memory. Tommy froze mid-lift, the shell half out of the crate, and gave you a long, unreadable look before setting it down and saying, quietly, that the words meant they are coming from below. It was the kind of thing you might have dismissed as nonsense in another time, but the way Tommy's voice dropped when he said it, and the way his eyes darted toward the dark clay walls of the trench made your skin prickle. Underground you knew the war had another face entirely, fought not in daylight but in tunnels, dug toward the enemy's lines where sappers planted mines that could erase whole stretches of men and fortification in a single shuddering instant. For the rest of the day you found yourself listening for things you had never noticed before. Faint, irregular vibrations under your boots, muffled knocks that might have been the settling of wet earth, or might have been something else. And once when you pressed your palm to the sandbag wall of the forward post, you could have sworn you felt the ghost of movement deep within the ground. The thought of it coiled in your stomach like ice. 2 days later, the German stretcher was returned without him. The bearers tight-lipped when asked where he'd been taken, but one of them slipped a folded scrap of paper into your hand before moving on. In the dim light of the dugout, you opened it to find a crude, smudged drawing, a jagged line for the trench, a cross to mark your position, and beneath it a series of black dots snaking toward the line from the enemy's side, ending in a small X under what you knew to be the munitions store. There was no signature, no words, only that map, and the implication of what it meant. The next hours blurred into a frantic mixture of quiet alarm and forced normalcy. You took the sketch to the sergeant, who studied it with his jaw set, then sent word up the chain, but you could tell from his clipped tone that he feared it might be too late. By nightfall, sappers from your side were in the trench with shovels and listening gear, crouched like predators over the earth, their faces pale under the lamplight as they strained to catch any trace of digging from the other side. It was in the dead hours before dawn, when the rain had finally stopped and the fog had rolled in so thick it felt like a weight on your shoulders, that one of the sappers straightened suddenly, his expression grim. He whispered something to the sergeant, and then there was movement everywhere. Orders to evacuate the forward section. Men pulling back in the narrow duckboards, boots splashing, someone dropping a rifle into the mud in their haste. You didn't hear the blast so much as feel it. A deep, tearing convulsion of the ground itself, the trench buckling, the air filling with earth and splinters and shards of metal, the world becoming nothing but roaring pressure and blackness. And when you came to coughing mud from your mouth, the forward post was simply gone, replaced by a crater wide enough to swallow a farmhouse. Somewhere far off, men were shouting, but you could barely make out the words over the ringing in your ears. And as you dragged yourself up, trembling, you knew 2 things with perfect clarity. The German had tried to warn you, and whatever game you were caught in now went far beyond the simple matter of enemy and ally. The crater still steamed in the grey morning light, its edges jagged with twisted timber and blackened sandbags, the smell of scorched earth curling upward like a ghost you could breathe in. And as you stood on the lip of it with your boots sinking into the wet clay, you felt that same hollow sensation you had once known in a dream. That certainty that the ground beneath you was not to be trusted, that the very earth could betray you at any moment, and the men beside you said nothing. Because what could be said when a piece of the world had simply vanished? The engineers worked in near silence, lowering themselves on ropes into the smoking wound, their faces set into the blank mask of men who have seen too much. And though they hauled up broken timbers and chunks of iron, the thing they were searching for, a sign of the tunnel, the path that had carried death from the German side, seemed to have collapsed entirely, swallowed by its own violence. You knew watching them that it was not only the trench they feared might be undermined, but the invisible line of trust between the men, because word was already spreading that you had been warned that someone had known, and still the post had been lost. The sergeant pulled you aside later, in the lee of a sandbag wall where the wind couldn't carry his words, and told you to keep quiet about the stretcher-bearer and the map. There were questions higher up, he said, questions about whether you had been seen speaking to the prisoner, about why a German would warn you at all, and in that moment you realized that in this war, the truth was not always the thing that kept you safe. Still, you couldn't leave it alone, not when the faint memory of that low, urgent German voice kept threading through your thoughts like a song half remembered. And that night, under the flicker of a hooded lamp, you found yourself talking to Corporal Hale, the oldest man in your unit who had a face carved from weather and habit and a memory for stories no one else wanted to tell. He listened without interruption as you described the words, the map, the blast. And when you were done, he lit a cigarette and said almost casually that during the early months of the war, there had been talk of a German officer who didn't agree with the Kaiser's command, a man who believed the real enemy was not in the trenches at all, but in the high halls of Berlin and London alike. And if that man had survived the years since, he might have been playing a dangerous, lonely game on both sides. For days afterward, the front seemed to settle into a grim rhythm, the kind you knew could break at any second. Patrols through the muck, the crack of rifles in the fog, the occasional shell whining overhead to burst somewhere just far enough away to let you breathe again. And yet you kept feeling as if you were being watched not by the enemy across no man's land, but by someone closer, someone whose gaze seemed to slip between the layers of mud and smoke, like a needle through cloth. The moment that feeling broke into action came one dusk when you were returning from the listening post and saw, just at the bend of the trench where the boards slicked under your boots, a small scrap of cloth snagged on a splintered post, blue-grey like the German uniforms, but with a faint stitched mark that was not regulation, a symbol you did not recognize. It was too deliberate to be an accident. You pocketed it without thinking, but that night, as you turned it over in your fingers under the lamplight, you noticed it had been folded and stitched at one edge, and inside was a tiny sliver of parchment no longer than your thumb. The parchment bore only 3 words in English, written in a precise hand. Watch the river. There was only one river in your sector, a slow dark ribbon of water that wound just behind the forward. Lines its banks choked with reeds and sandbags, and in winter it was more an obstacle than a feature. Yet the words it carried felt like an alarm, one you could not ignore. 2 nights later you were crouched in the mud near its edge, the air damp and smelling of frost when you saw them. 3 figures, moving low, not in the shambling way of exhausted soldiers, but with purpose, sliding something long and heavy into the water before letting the current take it downstream toward the rear. You could not see their faces in the dark, but you knew from the way they carried themselves that at least one of them was not from your side. And as you gripped your rifle tighter, the realization hit you with a cold clarity. Whatever game you had stumbled into was no longer about the front lines at all, but about something moving through the shadows behind them. And if you didn't unravel it, the next crater might not open in the mud, but in the very heart of the men you served beside. The rain had stopped some time before dawn, leaving the world soaked in silver, under a faint wash of morning light, the kind of brittle, hesitant brightness that made everything look like it had been carved from wet stone. And Daniel, still crouched low on the riverbank, where they had hidden through the night, felt the deep ache of cold seep into his bones, as if it were trying to hollow him out from the inside. He shifted slightly, careful not to break the quiet, because the German patrol had passed hours earlier, but the sound of boots and bayonets was still etched in his mind, like the echo of a nightmare you can't quite shake. Beside him, Lieutenant Reeves was staring out over the misted water, his jaw tight, eyes narrowed, one hand resting on the damp butt of his revolver. It was a gesture Daniel had seen before, but never for this long, as though Reeves was trying to read the river itself for signs of danger. The Frenchman they'd been following, Etienne, lay on his back a few feet away, his hat tilted down over his eyes, pretending to sleep but clearly listening to every ripple, every creak of leather in the damp air. The plan, if you could call it that, had been to cross the river before first light, slip into the ruined orchard on the far side, and then make their way toward the ridgeline where the map said there was an abandoned church that could shelter them for a day or two. But the river had risen in the night, swollen with the rain, and now its current was faster, angrier, less forgiving. "We can't cross here," Reeves said finally, his voice low but firm. "Not unless we want to be swept halfway to the channel." Etienne sat up, pushing his hat back. "There's a mill upstream," he said. "Old, maybe abandoned. Could be a shallow ford near it." But he let the word hang, letting them hear the unspoken warning in it. The mill might not be as empty as we'd like. Daniel, still new to this shadow world of soldiers and guides, felt the knot of decision forming between them. Crossing the river meant moving forward toward their objective. Staying here meant waiting, risking discovery, freezing in their own damp skin. He found himself looking to Reeves, because Reeves always decided. The lieutenant glanced at him, then at the river, then at Etienne. "We move for the mill," he said, quiet and quick. The walk was slow and cautious, their boots sucking in the mud, every step a risk of sound. The land curved gently upward, and the outlines of shattered trees stood like black bones against the pale morning sky. When the mill came into view, it was worse than Daniel expected. The roof sagged, the windows were gaping holes, and the water wheel was broken, lying half submerged in the current like some drowned beast. Reeves signaled for them to spread out, approach in a half circle. Daniel's breath came shallow. He could hear his own heartbeat loud in his ears. Etienne went first, slipping toward the doorway like a shadow. Reeves followed, revolver ready. Daniel brought up the rear, his fingers clenched so tight on his rifle that the knuckles hurt. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of mildew and damp wood. There was movement, a shuffling, faint but unmistakable. Reeves froze, hand raised. Then, from the far corner, a figure emerged. It was not a soldier. It was a girl, maybe 16, her hair tangled, her face pale with hunger. She was clutching a bundle to her chest, and when Daniel realized it was a baby, the sound of the war outside seemed to recede for a moment. Etienne spoke first, soft in French. She answered, her voice barely more than a whisper. Daniel couldn't understand the words, but he could read the fear in her eyes, the way she kept glancing toward the rear of the mill, as if something, or someone else was there. Reeves gestured for Etienne to translate. "She says she's been hiding here for weeks," Etienne said. "Her family is gone. The baby is her brother's child." And he hesitated. "She says, there are Germans in the village up the hill, a small unit. They come here sometimes to grind corn." Daniel's stomach tightened. That meant this place wasn't safe at all. It meant they had to move fast. But the girl's eyes, dark, desperate, locked on him, and he realized she wasn't asking them to save her. She was asking them not to leave her behind. Outside, somewhere not far away, a dog barked, and just like that, they were out of time. The bark of the unseen dog hung in the damp air for a moment longer than seemed natural, a sharp echo that rippled across the mist-trapped fields and through the half-collapsed timbers of the mill like a warning bell struck in some invisible tower. And Daniel, standing half in shadow near the warped doorframe, felt a sudden heaviness in his chest, as though the very earth beneath his boots understood that this sound, this simple noise of an animal doing what animals do, was in fact the first thread pulled in what could unravel the fragile web of safety that had been holding them together for the last few hours. For Reeves had already stiffened in that way. Daniel had come to recognize his eyes narrowing, his weight shifting imperceptibly toward the girl and the bundle in her arms, while Etienne's hand, resting lightly on the barrel of his worn carbine, flexed just enough to show he was ready for movement at a moment's notice. And in that charged stillness, the girl's gaze darted toward the rear of the mill again. her lips pressing into a line so thin it was nearly invisible in the dim light, as if the act of holding in whatever words she might have spoken was itself a battle of will. The air inside was thick with the smell of rotting grain and damp stone, the floorboards soft underfoot where water had seeped in for years, and somewhere beyond the broken water wheel, the current of the river muttered its endless, indifferent monologue. But now every sound seemed amplified, the quiet shifting of the baby in its wrappings, the almost inaudible exhalation from Reeves, the faint rasp of leather as Daniel adjusted the strap of his rifle, and outside the dog barked again. Closer this time, followed by the crunch of boots on wet earth, a rhythm, slow but steady, deliberate in a way, that did not belong to a farmer returning from the fields, but to men trained to move with patience, with awareness, with the certainty that what they sought would not escape. Etienne spoke quickly to the girl in a hushed tone, his words low and urgent, and though Daniel could not follow the language, he understood the meaning well enough in the way her hands tightened around the bundle, in the way her eyes flickered between each of them and then toward the cracks in the wall where daylight leaked in like pale knives. She answered him in short bursts, her voice trembling not with uncertainty, but with the raw knowledge of what was coming. And when Etienne turned back to them, his mouth was set in that grim expression Daniel had first seen back on the ridge, when the artillery had started up before dawn. "She says they come in groups of 3 or 4, he murmured, his French accent thickening the English. "They use the back path from the village, not the main road. If they're coming now, they will be here in minutes." Reeves didn't look at Etienne or at the girl, or even at Daniel. He stared at the ragged hole in the mill wall that framed a slice of grey sky and the swaying tops of trees beyond, as if weighing every path, every second, every breath they might have left. And then, in that low voice that somehow cut through the rising thrum of Daniel's pulse, he said, "We don't have minutes. We have now." The girl seemed to understand before Etienne could translate, because she moved suddenly, silently, toward the rear of the mill where a heap of broken sacks and splintered wood concealed a narrow opening in the wall. Crouching there with the bundle pressed close, her eyes fixed on them, as if she were ready to follow if they signaled, to vanish into whatever shadows lay beyond. But Daniel felt the sick weight of the choice pressing against them, to flee and take her with them, slowing their pace, risking discovery, or to slip away alone and leave her to whatever fate was marching closer with those boots on the mud. Outside, the steps paused, the silence so complete it seemed to draw the air out of the mill. And Daniel's mind flashed unbidden, to the trench line days before, to the moment when silence had broken into gunfire without warning. And he knew that when those footsteps resumed, it would be too late to choose anything but the instinct of survival. So he shifted toward the girl, meaning to speak, to act, to do something before the balance tipped. And that was when the faint creak of the front door's hinges cut through the stillness like the first crack of ice beneath your feet on a winter pond. And all at once every heartbeat in the room was a drum of war. The door swung inward with a groan that seemed to stretch time itself. The dim light from outside spilling into the hollowed interior of the mill and catching in motes of dust that swirled lazily in the air. An almost beautiful sight were it not for the shadow that entered with it, the silhouette of a man whose posture, alone, upright, deliberate, with one hand resting against the stock of the rifle slung across his chest, told Daniel everything he needed to know about the kind of training, the kind of cold intent, that had brought him here. And for an instant Daniel's breath hitched in that reflexive way it had back in the trenches when the flare would go up and suddenly the enemy's position was revealed in stark, merciless light, the space between life and death no thicker than a line scratched in the mud. The man stepped inside, boots striking the warped planks with an even, unhurried rhythm. And in that brief pause, before he took another step, Daniel caught sight of the insignia on his shoulder, dark against the grey of his coat, though the details blurred in the gloom. What was not blurred, however, was the shape that followed him. Another figure, shorter, broader in the shoulders, the barrel of his weapon angled slightly toward the ground, but his eyes already scanning the interior in quick, precise arcs, searching for shapes, for movement, for the small betrayal of breath where there should be none. And somewhere behind them, just outside the frame of the doorway, a third voice muttered something in a low guttural tone that made the girl stiffen in her crouch. her knuckles whitening against the bundle she held. Etienne's gaze slid to Reeves, a question and an urgency contained in a single flicker of movement, and Reeves, without shifting more than a fraction, tilted his head toward the rear wall where the narrow gap lay hidden. The signal clear enough that Daniel felt the urge to move, to grab the girl and slip away before the tightening coil of this moment snapped, but the creak of another footstep on the boards froze him in place, and now the first soldier had turned his head slightly, his eyes adjusting to the pale oval of his face, catching the weak light that leaked through the broken roof, and Daniel could see it, the recognition, the narrowing of pupils, the minute tightening of the mouth. Not the look of a man startled by discovery, but one who has just confirmed what he already suspected. The baby stirred then, a small muffled sound like a sigh, but enough to turn the soldier's attention toward the pile of grain sacks, his weight shifting forward, his boot sliding across the floor with that soft scrape of leather on wood, and in that half-second Daniel's body acted without consulting his mind, stepping into the open with the rifle angled low but ready, his voice steady in a way that felt borrowed from someone braver, calling out in the halting, imperfect German he had picked up from overheard orders at the front, a bluff about there being sickness here, a warning to stay back. And though the words were clumsy, the intent was sharp, because the soldier stopped, eyes flicking between Daniel and the shadow behind him, calculating. Reeves moved then, not a lunge but a controlled step into the soldier's line of sight, his own weapon angled with the calm authority of someone who had stood at enough killing distances to know exactly what each breath cost, and for a moment the air seemed to solidify between them, as if the next exchange would not be of words, but of lead and blood. And then the voice outside called again, more sharply, and the second soldier's head turned toward the door, his jaw tightening in a way that suggested orders had been given that required obedience over curiosity. Without lowering his weapon, the first man took a step back, then another, his eyes never leaving Daniel's, something unspoken passing between them, not mercy, not fear, but a kind of mutual recognition that in another place, another war, they might have been simply men rather than enemies. And then, with a final flick of his gaze toward the shadowed pile where the girl hid, he turned and stepped out into the grey light, the second soldier following, the door swinging shut behind them with a sound softer than Daniel would have expected, as if the building itself had been holding its breath. For a long moment none of them moved, the silence so complete it felt dangerous, until Reeves exhaled slowly, the edge of tension in his frame easing just enough to make him look human again, and Etienne crossed to the girl, helping her to her feet with a gentleness that contrasted so violently with the still-fading image of the men who had just been here, and Daniel, feeling the tremor in his own hands now that the moment had passed, realized that the footsteps outside were growing fainter, carrying the danger away for now, but leaving behind a new question that burned as fiercely as the relief. How long until they came back, and what choices would they be forced to make when they did? Night fell like a slow tide over the mill, the sky outside bleeding from ash-gray into the kind of darkness that felt thicker than mere absence of light. And though the sounds of boots on the road had faded hours earlier, they remained restless inside. The air waited with that peculiar kind of silence that comes not from peace but from the awareness that danger has simply stepped out of sight for the moment, circling like a wolf in the tree line, and Daniel found himself standing near the broken window, eyes fixed on the faint glimmer of stars, wondering if any of the men he had fought beside months earlier were looking at those same constellations now, or if they had been swallowed whole by the mud and the fire before they had the chance. Reeves sat against the far wall, his rifle across his knees, the rhythmic motion of him checking and rechecking the bolt almost hypnotic in its repetition, the faint metallic clicks weaving into the creak of Etienne pacing near the door, and in the corner the girl, whose name they had still not learned, for she seemed either unwilling or unable to give it, was feeding the child from a chipped tin cup, her face turned slightly away, the dim lamplight catching the streaks of dirt across her cheekbones, making her look older than she could possibly be, yet there was something in the way her hand cupped the child's head that carried a kind of defiance, a refusal to let the war strip from her the small rituals that tether people to something more than survival. When Etienne finally spoke, It was in a low voice that still seemed to cut through the air like a blade, suggesting they should leave before dawn. Take the path through the orchard to the east and skirt the road toward the river, because if the soldiers had been here once, they would be back, and the next time their patience might be shorter. Reeves nodded but did not look up, and Daniel, feeling the weight of that decision pressing in on him, knew instinctively that the orchard route meant more than just avoiding the patrol. It meant heading deeper into contested ground, toward the edge of the front where the thunder of artillery was constant and the distinction between enemy lines and friendly ones was measured not in maps but in bodies. They spoke in low bursts, pausing every time the wind outside shifted, listening for the telltale rhythm of boots or the grind of wheels. And in those pauses, Daniel's mind would wander unbidden to the faces of the men he had lost in the mud. Harris, who had shared his last cigarette with him before the charge. McBride, whose laughter had been loud enough to carry even over the shell fire. And for the briefest of moments he imagined them standing in this very room, their uniforms ragged, their eyes hollow but familiar, as if they had been waiting here for him all along, a ghostly guard holding back the dark. Sometime in the hours before dawn, Reeves moved to the door and opened it just enough to let in the smell of wet earth and the faint rustle of the orchard beyond, and without a word, they began to move, Etienne leading the girl close behind with the child strapped against her chest beneath a worn blanket, Daniel in the middle scanning the tree line, and Reeves at the rear, the soft crunch of their boots on the damp ground sounding impossibly loud in the sleeping world. And as they slipped into the orchard, the skeletal branches arching overhead like the ribs of some long-dead beast, Daniel felt the strange, unwelcome memory of his first night raid return, the smell of mud and frost, the whisper of orders in the dark, the knowledge that each step forward was a step deeper into the unknown. They had gone perhaps 200 yards when the wind shifted again, carrying with it not the expected quiet of the countryside, but a low, muffled thud, followed by another, and then another, the slow, deliberate rhythm of distant guns. Too far to be aimed here, but close enough to remind them that the ground they walked was a breathing thing, and it was waking up. And Etienne slowed, raising one hand to signal a halt, his head tilted as though listening not to the shells but to something softer beneath them, some subtle change in the night that the others could not yet hear. It came a moment later, faint but distinct, the snap of a twig underweight, not the random fall of a branch but the sharp, almost deliberate sound of movement, and Daniel felt every muscle in his body tense, his fingers tightening around the stock of his rifle, his eyes searching the darkness between the trunks where shadows swayed gently but did not retreat. And then, as if the night itself had decided to answer their fear, a voice called out from somewhere ahead, low, urgent, speaking French, the words coming fast enough that Daniel caught only fragments, but the relief that broke across Etienne's face told him they were not about to walk into a firing line. From the darkness emerged two figures in ragged uniforms, their helmet-scuffed rifles slung at awkward angles as though they had been running for some time, and when they drew closer the lamplight from Etienne's small lantern caught the grime on their faces, the exhaustion etched deep into their eyes, and one of them, barely more than a boy, gasped that the village ahead was not safe, that German forces had moved in 2 days ago and were using the church as a command post, and that any path east would take them straight into the heart of the occupation unless they turned north now toward the marshes. The marshes, Reeves muttered under his breath, were worse than any road. Open, wet ground, no cover, the kind of place where a patrol could spot you half a mile away. But Etienne was already shaking his head, knowing as they all did that the alternative was to walk directly into enemy hands. And Daniel felt that creeping realization settle in again, the one that had been with him since the first day he had woken in this war, that here there were no good choices, only those that bought you a little more time before the next bad one arrived. The decision was made with that same grim economy that all wartime decisions seemed to demand, not weighed in the luxury of hours or even minutes, but in the sharp clipped exchange of glances, between men who understood that hesitation could be deadlier than a bullet. And so without another word Etienne turned northward, leading them away from the orchard and toward the dark. sprawl of the marshes, the air growing colder and wetter with every step, until the earth beneath their boots began to soften, sucking faintly at their souls, as if the land itself were reluctant to let them pass. The two ragged French soldiers who had found them now took the lead. Their familiarity with the terrain, the only reassurance that they were not walking blindly into a mire, though even they moved cautiously, their steps deliberate, testing each patch of ground before committing their weight, because here the danger did not come in the sharp crack of rifle fire or the deafening roar of artillery, but in the silent betrayal of the earth, the way it could shift without warning beneath you, swallowing a man to the waist in a heartbeat, and the knowledge that once trapped, the marsh would not let you go without taking something in return. Daniel kept his eyes on the narrow trail. The soldier seemed to see where he saw only a tangle of reeds and pools of black water. His mind caught in that tense rhythm of movement where every step felt both too slow and too fast, each moment stretching in the uncertainty of whether they were being followed, whether the night around them was truly empty or simply holding its breath until they stumbled. The wind here smelled different. Not the acrid temps of smoke or the metallic edge of blood that clung to the villagers near the front, but the heavy, almost sweet rot of stagnant water and decomposing vegetation, a smell that seemed to cling to the back of the throat, making each breath feel weighted, and in that strange damp quiet, the sound of their passage was amplified, the muted squelch of boots, the rustle of reeds, the occasional splash when someone's foot slipped into deeper water. Behind him, Reeves muttered under his breath about the folly of walking into open ground at night, his voice low enough that only Daniel caught the words, and though Daniel understood the instinct, the need to push against the fear with complaint, with anything that felt like control, he also knew that silence was their only real ally here, because in the flat expanse of the marsh sound traveled far, and it would take only one stray noise to carry to an enemy patrol watching from some distant dry rise. They walked for what felt like hours, though Daniel could not tell if time was truly stretching, or if the landscape itself was playing tricks, every turn in the path revealing only more of the same, endless reeds swaying gently in the breeze, pools of water reflecting the thin light of the moon, the occasional dark shape of a heron lifting off silently as they approached, until at last the lead soldier raised a hand and signaled for them to stop. Crouching low and pointing toward a darker shape on the horizon, a low embankment that marked the edge of firmer ground. It was there, he whispered, that a small group of resistance fighters kept watch over the northern approach to the occupied village, and if they could reach them before dawn, they might find a way around the German positions without being seen. But even as he spoke, Daniel sensed a hesitation in his tone, as though the man were measuring not just the distance but the risk, aware that any crossing of the open ground between here and that embankment would leave them exposed. Etienne crouched beside him, peering into the dark, and after a long moment, he nodded, gesturing for them to move in pairs, each waiting for the one ahead to reach the cover of the embankment, before following, and Daniel felt that old familiar tightness in his chest, the one that came just before stepping into no man's land, where you could feel the invisible eyes of the enemy on you, even if you never saw them. When it was his turn, he moved quickly, his boots slipping on the slick grass, but holding just enough the cold air burning his lungs. As he kept his head low, every sense sharpened to the faintest sound. The distant rumble of artillery, the rustle of reeds in the wind, the sudden splash of something unseen in the water to his left. And by the time he slid in beside Reeves at the base of the embankment, his breath was ragged, his hands clenched so tightly around his rifle that they ached. They regrouped in the shadow of the bank, the marsh stretching out behind them like some vast sleeping animal, and ahead, just visible in the first pale hint of dawn, was the faint outline of the resistance post, a low makeshift shelter of wood and earth half hidden by brush, where a figure with a scarf pulled high over his face stood watching their approach with the kind of stillness that suggested both patience and suspicion. As they drew nearer, the man raised a hand, and in the soft light Daniel saw that his other rested lightly on the grip of a pistol tucked into his belt, his eyes flicking from one face to the next as though weighing their worth. And when Etienne gave a quiet greeting in French, the man's posture eased just slightly, enough for him to step forward and motion them inside. Inside, the air was warmer, the smell of damp earth mingling with the faint scent of woods, and a small group of men and women, armed and watchful, turned to look at them as they entered, their expressions unreadable in the dim light. And Daniel felt again that strange dissonance, the way each new place in this war could hold both the possibility of safety and the certainty of danger, depending on which way the wind happened to blow. Etienne began to speak with the leader, their voices low, the words too rapid for Daniel to follow fully. But the tone carried a mix of urgency and calculation, and as he listened, Daniel realized that whatever came next would take them even closer to the front, into territory where the lines between soldier, spy, and civilian blurred until there were no lines at all. The leader of the small resistance cell, a narrow-shouldered man with hair cropped close to the skull and the pallor of one who had spent more nights underground than above it, listened to Etienne's hurried explanation without interruption, his dark eyes fixed not on the Frenchman's face but on some invisible line just past his shoulder, as if gauging not only the weight of the words but the measure of the men and the danger they might carry into this hidden corner of the marsh. And when at last Etienne's voice fell silent, the man shifted his gaze slowly toward Daniel and Reeves, his scrutiny quiet and unblinking in the way of those who had survived long enough to learn that trust was a currency too, rare to be spent quickly. And then he exhaled through his nose and gestured toward the far end of the shelter where a crude map sketched in charcoal on a strip of coarse linen hung from a splintered beam, its lines representing not so much geography as possibility. He rose without a sound and beckoned them forward, his finger tracing a meandering path along the drawn marshes, across a narrow strip of open pasture and into the irregular shapes that marked the northern outskirts of the occupied village, speaking in a voice so low Daniel had to lean closer to catch the words, the tone a mixture of instruction and warning as he explained that a German supply convoy was due to pass through that road by nightfall, escorted but lightly enough that a well-timed disruption could stall their movements for hours, maybe even force them to pull men from the front to guard future shipments, and that in this war, where every delay could shift the balance of some distant battle, such an act was worth any risk. Daniel glanced at Reeves, whose mouth had tightened into that stubborn line Daniel had seen before, the one that usually preceded a muttered curse or a half-voiced protest. But this time the sergeant said nothing, only shifted his weight and rested a hand on the butt of his revolver, as if acknowledging that the choice had already been made for them, that in this place and time they were not strangers stumbling through someone else's war, but participants drawn into its machinery as surely as any man in uniform. The leader, they learned his name was Marcel, produced a folded strip of oilcloth from his pocket, unwrapping it to reveal 3 small parcels bound in waxed paper, their contents unmistakable even before he spoke. Explosives, each charge shaped for quick placement beneath a wagon axle or against the thin steel skin of a fuel drum, their weight strangely at odds with their size, as if danger had its own gravity pulling at the air around it. And Daniel felt the muscles in his stomach nod as Marcel pushed one into his hands, the unspoken trust heavy as the clay-packed powder inside. They left the shelter in pairs, moving along the inside curve of the embankment, until the marsh gave way to a narrow track lined with poplars, their bare branches rattling softly in the wind like bones strung on wire. And though the ground here was firmer, the sense of exposure was sharper, for the open sky above seemed to press down on them with every step, the light growing colder as the day inched toward dusk, and Daniel found himself counting his breaths, timing them to the crunch of his boots, trying to fix his mind on the rhythm rather than the gnawing awareness that each bend in the path might reveal the dark green-gray of German uniforms. They reached the pasture just as the first long shadows began to stretch from the hedgerows, and Marcel motioned for them to take cover in the lee of a collapsed stone wall, its moss-covered blocks smelling faintly of damp and decay, the scent familiar now, as if the entire countryside had been steeped in the same mixture of rot and rain. And here they waited, crouched low, the silence broken only by the distant caw of a crow and the faint click of Reeves checking his revolver cylinder. Time passed in the strange way it always did before action, each moment slow enough to feel like an hour, yet somehow rushing toward an inevitable point. And then, faint at first, but growing clearer, came the rumble of wooden wheels on packed dirt, the muted thud of hooves, and the irregular jingle of harness chains. The sounds rounding the far bend in the road long before the convoy itself came into view, giving Daniel and the others just enough time to press themselves flatter against the earth, their breath-shallow eyes fixed on the narrowing gap between hedgerows where the lead wagon would appear. The first to emerge was a pair of mounted soldiers, their rifles slung but their eyes scanning the road ahead, their posture bored but alert in that peculiar way of men who had traveled to many empty miles without incident yet still knew the taste of ambush. And behind them rolled two covered wagons, the canvas bulging at odd angles that suggested crates stacked haphazardly beneath, followed by another mounted guard and a third wagon whose tarp was drawn tighter, the outlines beneath smoother. And Daniel wondered if it held food, munitions, or something less obvious, but no less valuable in a war where supply lines were veins and arteries, their severing as lethal as any bullet. Marcel's hand closed briefly on Daniel's arm, a silent signal, and then he was moving. Low, quick, a shadow slipping from the shelter of the wall to cross the strip of ditch at the roadside, his boots making no sound on the damp earth, and Daniel followed without thought, the cold air sharp in his lungs, his hands tightening around the explosive charge as he reached the far wheel of the second wagon, the wood close enough to smell the faint tang of pitch in the axle grease, the German driver's voice carrying faintly as he muttered to the man beside him, oblivious to the presence just inches beyond his peripheral vision. It was over in seconds. The small packet pressed against the axle housing the fuse snug beneath the canvas flap, the movement shielded by the wagon's own bulk, and then Daniel was back in the ditch, heart hammering so hard he could hear it in his ears. The convoy passing without pause, the sound of wheels and hooves fading into the distance until only the wind remained, carrying with it the faint scent of horses and canvas. They waited until the road had emptied into silence, then slipped from their cover and began moving quickly in the opposite direction, Marcel leading them along a narrow gully that wound between two low rises, its course hidden from the road but open enough for them to keep pace. And as the last light bled from the sky, a muted boom rolled across the fields, followed by the sharper crack of splintering wood and the faint, panicked whinny of a horse. And though they were already too far to see the damage, Daniel could picture it, the second wagon lurching sideways, its axle shattered, the column halting in confusion, and somewhere in the midst of it, a captain cursing in clipped German as he tried to guess whether the road itself had betrayed him or the shadows had teeth. Night had fully fallen by the time they reached the marsh's edge again, the ground softening underfoot, the reeds whispering in the wind like 1,000 unseen voices, and though exhaustion pressed at the edges of Daniel's awareness, there was a strange clarity in his thoughts now, a sense that he had crossed some invisible threshold, not from safety into danger, for that had happened long ago, but from observer into actor, from one who simply endured the war to one who had shaped, however slightly, its course. Back at the resistance post, the air was warmer and the fire brighter, the faces of the men and women less guarded now, though still edged with the kind of wariness that no victory, however small, could erase, and Marcel clapped Etienne once on the shoulder before disappearing into a side chamber, leaving them with bowls of thin stew and a silence that felt less like suspicion and more like the quiet after a long-held breath. Daniel ate slowly, the heat of the broth grounding him in the present, yet his mind kept circling back to the moment beneath the wagon, the nearness of the enemy, the smell of grease and horse, the knowledge that one misstep could have ended not only his life but theirs. And as Reeves muttered something about bloody close calls, and worse to come, Daniel found himself neither disagreeing nor nodding, but simply staring into the fire, watching the flames curl and shift, thinking of all the roads still ahead. The fire's warmth clung to him for only a few moments after the last spoonful of stew was gone, its fleeting comfort chased away by the damp breath of the marsh seeping back into the seams of the shelter, and somewhere, beyond the flickering orange glow, the night pressed close with the weight of uncounted miles of enemy ground, silent, but for the occasional ripple of wind through reeds or the far-off crack of some solitary rifle that might have been no more than a branch snapping under frost. Etienne sat with his back to the wall, head bowed over a scrap of paper on which he was sketching shapes. That might have been routes or targets, or simply the restless loops of a man who could not sit still without plotting, and Daniel found himself watching the quick, neat movements of the pencil, wondering if those lines would one day lead them toward safety or into another narrow ditch with a pounding heart and an enemy close enough to smell. Reeves, for his part, had wedged himself into a corner with his boots out toward the fire, the revolver resting on his thigh and his eyes half-lidded in a posture that looked like sleep but was betrayed by the occasional twitch of his jaw, as if even in stillness he was chewing over the memory of the road and the convoy. And Daniel thought of how many times the man must have crouched like that in other wars, waiting for some new dawn to reveal whether his choices had bought him another day or merely borrowed hours. Marcel's return was as quiet as his departure, a shadow peeling itself from the darker corner of the shelter, his movements unhurried but purposeful, and he lowered himself to the earth beside the fire with the air of someone who had been listening from just beyond the threshold, weighing the voices against the silences, and now brought with him not orders but the simple fact of his presence, a reminder that trust here was a currency paid in time and endurance rather than promises. From his coat he produced a small tin, the kind that once might have held sweets or lozenges, and flicked it open to reveal a neat row of cartridges gleaming dully in the firelight, their brass sides catching the flame as he set them between Daniel and Reeves without a word. And Daniel was struck by the strange intimacy of the gesture, as if the man had handed him not ammunition but a key to some unspoken pact, a signal that their survival had become tied together in ways that could not easily be undone. The night deepened, its hours stretching thin, and though the talk among the resistance cell remained sparse, Daniel sensed a subtle shift beneath the quiet, the way glances lingered a fraction longer, the way a loaf of bread was passed without hesitation, the way someone moved a blanket so it covered more of his shoulder, and he thought that perhaps in this place, victory was measured less in the explosions along some unseen road than in the slow erosion of walls between strangers. Sleep, when it came, was shallow and fractured, threaded with images that did not quite belong to dreams, the pale shape of a horse lurching against its harness, the cold slick of axle grease under his fingers, the rasp of canvas as it shifted above crates whose contents remained forever hidden. And when he woke to the faint grey of pre-dawn filtering through the slats of the shelter, he felt no more rested than when he had closed his eyes. But the taut coil in his chest had eased just enough to let him stand without his knees locking. Outside, the marsh was a muted expanse of frost and mist, the reeds bowing under a weight of dew that turned their tips to threads of glass, and the air carried that brittle clarity that comes only in the hour before the sun burns through the horizon, when every sound, the soft drip of water from a branch, the muted crunch of boots on frozen ground, seemed amplified, as if the world were holding its breath. Marcel stood at the edge of the embankment, his back to the shelter, studying a line of trees where the mist pooled thickest, and without turning he spoke low, his voice almost lost in the morning air, telling them that the convoy's wreck had been discovered before midnight, that the Germans had sent scouts into the surrounding fields, and that by nightfall there would be more boots on the ground between here and the village than in the past month combined. Daniel felt the words settle in his chest with the same cold weight as the marsh air, not as fear exactly, but as the recognition that yesterday's act, brief, precise, and already fading into the past, had set into motion a widening circle of consequences, the kind that would ripple outward, until they touched things and people far beyond the reach of his sight. Reeves joined him at the embankment, the brim of his cap pulled low, and for a moment they stood side by side in silence, the three of them, staring into the fog where shapes might have been nothing more than bent reeds, or might have been men crouching low, waiting for the light to lift. And Daniel realized that in this war, the difference between the two was often decided only by who moved first. You stand there for a moment in the damp trench, with the icy wind wrapping itself around you like an unwanted blanket, while the strange pale light over the ridge pulses faintly as though breathing in slow deep rhythms, and for reasons you can't explain the sight makes. The tiny hairs on your arms rise even under the heavy wool of your coat. The men around you have gone silent, their usual banter dying on their lips, as they all turn toward the ridge in unison. the occasional drip of rainwater from the sandbags above becoming loud in the absence of voices, and you feel a strange unity in that moment, as though every living soul in the trench is connected by a single thread of curiosity and unease. Somewhere down the line a soldier coughs sharply, the sound muffled by the scarf wrapped around his face, and the small disruption of the silence makes you realize that everyone's hands are resting on the worn stocks of their rifles without even noticing. The instinctive gesture born from weeks of living in a place where anything unexpected could be dangerous. The light shifts in tone, becoming warmer now, almost amber, as if some hidden fire was burning just beyond the hill, and yet there is no smoke, no scent of burning wood or oil drifting on the wind, only that quiet, unearthly glow that seems to call to you without words. You remember stories you overheard in whispers during the long night stays of strange occurrences at the front of lights, that moved like living things, of sounds in the distance that came from nowhere and went nowhere, and you had dismissed them then as tired minds playing tricks. But now you are not so certain. One of the younger soldiers beside you, his helmet far too big for his thin face, leans toward you and mutters that maybe it's a flare from the other side. Yet his voice trembles as if even he knows that flares do not behave like this, do not linger and shift in color as though they are alive. A cold drop of rain slides down the back of your neck and you shiver, feeling the dampness settling into your bones, and you think that perhaps the only way to rid yourself of this gnawing uncertainty is to see the source for yourself. Though the idea of climbing over the lip of the trench feels like willingly stepping into another world. Somewhere in the command dugout, an officer's voice barks orders, the sound traveling through the narrow earthen corridors of the trench. But it is unclear whether those orders concern the light at all, and the lack of clarity only fuels the restless curiosity that has begun to spread among the men like a quiet fever. You hear the crunch of boots in the mud as a small group is sent forward toward the listening post, their shapes hunched and cautious against the drizzle, and for a moment you watch their figures dissolve into the darkness before they are swallowed by the folds of the land. The light pulses once more, this time brighter, washing the trench in a faint golden hue for a heartbeat, before fading back into its earlier amber glow, and you realize your breath has quickened without your consent, as if you are preparing for something even though you don't know what it is. The man next to you whispers a prayer under his breath, his words soft and hurried, and in that quiet moment you think about the strange way fear and fascination often live side by side, each feeding the other until you cannot tell where one ends and the other begins. A sudden faint sound rises from beyond the ridge, not the deep rolling boom of artillery nor the sharp crack of rifles, but something softer, stranger, like the low hum of wind moving through hollow stone, and the hair on your neck prickles, because it does not belong to this place. The group that went forward does not return right away, and with each passing minute the weight of waiting grows heavier, the air thick with an unspoken agreement among the men not to break the silence unless absolutely necessary. As though noise itself might draw something unwanted closer, a distant shape moves across the glow, just a shadow at first, but its outline is too tall, too narrow, and it moves with a strange steadiness that doesn't match the stumbling gait of a man walking through mud, and you realize you are holding your breath. The light fades abruptly, leaving only darkness and the pale gleam of moonlight on wet barbed wire, and for a long heartbeat, you wonder if you imagined it all, if the long days and cold nights have finally begun to blur the line between waking and dreaming. Then, without warning, a sharp whistle from down the trench calls for readiness, and you grip your rifle more tightly than before, your fingers finding the familiar cold metal as you prepare for something, though no one seems to know exactly what that something might be. The sharp whistle still echoes faintly in your ears. When movement stirs along the trench, the sound of boots dragging through wet clay and the low scrape of rifle bolts being drawn back and checked, and in that sudden tightening of the air you feel the presence of something approaching, not in the way a man senses another's footfall behind him, but in the deeper, older way an animal feels the shift of the wind before a predator steps into view. A knowledge that arrives without proof yet carries the weight of certainty. Officers pass along the word in curt fragments. Hold your positions, watch the wire, keep low, and you crouch. The damp earth cold beneath your knees, your eyes searching the jagged silhouette of the ridge where the strange light had burned moments before. But now the horizon is empty, save for the restless twitch of shadows as the clouds move across the moon, and you begin to wonder if whatever drew those forward scouts into the darkness has already slipped past your line unseen. Somewhere to your left, a flare bursts upward with a sharp hiss, flooding the trench with a sudden white glare that paints every face in stark relief and stretches every shadow into long black claws against the mud walls, and for an instant you think you see something at the edge of the light, a tall, narrow figure just beyond the wire. But when the flare sputters and dies, the space is empty again, and you are left with the cold taste of doubt in your mouth. The first crack of rifle fire shatters. The silence distant at first, then closer, and soon the answering rattle of machine guns begins their staccato rhythm, vibrating through the trench timbers like the rapid heartbeat of some enormous unseen creature, and men press their backs harder against the mud as shouts rise from somewhere in the dark, the words lost in the overlapping chorus of gunfire and shouted orders. You hear yourself breathing harder, your pulse hammering as you edge forward to the firing step. Peering over the parapet into the no man's land, now bathed in the cold silver light of another flare, and what you see there steals the warmth from your hands. Not a massed charge of enemy infantry, but scattered shapes. Moving low and quick across the churned mud, their forms unfamiliar, the way they shift, unnerving, as though the moonlight slides from them more reluctantly than it does from the sandbags and the wire. A shot cracks from beside you, and one of the shapes jerks, collapsing awkwardly into the muck, but the others keep moving, weaving between the tangles of barbed wire with a disquieting ease, and in the din you realize no one is quite sure what they are firing at, only that it is coming closer, and in war sometimes that is reason enough. The shadows reach the outer edge of the wire, and the nearest soldier to them, a grizzled veteran with mud crusted into the creases of his greatcoat, tosses a grenade into their midst. It explodes with a dull wet thump, rather than the usual sharp crack, and for a heartbeat afterward there is silence. Then a high keening sound that raises the hairs on your neck and makes the man beside you mutter something in a language you don't understand. Then, as suddenly as it began, the firing slackens, the shapes retreating back into the folds of the land, melting into the same darkness from which they emerged, and the trench falls quiet again, except for the labored breathing of the men and the slow drip of rain from the sagging sandbags above. The officer nearest you exhales sharply, mutters that it was probably nothing more than a probing attack, yet his voice carries the hollow tone of someone speaking to convince himself rather than those around him, and when your eyes meet his, you see the unspoken agreement that tonight's events will not be discussed more than necessary. For there are some things in war that men prefer to leave unnamed. You remain there for a while longer, watching the ridge for any hint of movement, but the night has swallowed all traces of the strange light and the shapes that followed it, leaving only the pale, shifting clouds and the low whisper of the wind through the wire. And when at last you lower yourself from the firing step and sink back into the trench's damp embrace, you cannot shake the feeling that whatever passed between you and that darkness tonight was not finished. Later, in the thin, grey light of dawn, the scouts who went forward return in silence, their faces pale and eyes wide, each carrying the weight of something they will not put into words. And as you share a brief nod with one of them, you realize that you are now bound together by a moment that belongs to none of the official histories of this war, but will live in the quiet corners of your mind long after the guns have gone silent. And so you stand there, mud clinging to your boots, the smell of wet earth and cordite lingering in the air, knowing that you have survived another night in a war that is as much about endurance as it is about victory. And though you cannot say what lies ahead, you understand that the line between the living and the dead, the real and the unreal, is far thinner here than you had ever imagined. If you've been pulled into this journey through the mud, the fear, and the strange unknown of waking up in World War I, then make sure you subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. Like this video if you felt the tension, share it with friends who love immersive storytelling, and comment below. Tell us what you would have done in that trench under that strange light. And don't forget to watch our previous videos about what was sex really like in ancient Rome, ancient Egypt, and medieval times. Now, good night, dear listener.